Pokemon has decided recently to experiment with its newer formats, but one concept I don't think we've seen enough yet is a format that unbans a small pool of restricted legendaries and sees how they do in a normal format. Considering we only have access to these legendaries for a single year at a time, it'd be pretty cool to see one of these formats that has all of the restricted Pokemon banned besides just a handful. I want to figure out what the most reasonable unbans among this restricted pool would be, just because of the fact that a lot of these Pokemon have unfortunately become so heavily power capped. Now, I'm not going to necessarily dwell on Pokemon like Cosmog, Cosmoem, and Calyrex too much because these three Pokemon are objectively just completely unusable, but I do want to focus it instead on some Pokemon that I think are actually legitimately usable that could in theory be actually allowed. So if you guys want to see me cover more videos like this, let's get this video to 300 likes and I can explore some other banned Pokemon that could potentially be allowed but aren't necessarily in Scarlet and Violet right now. Also, make sure you subscribe to help us reach our next goal of 10,000 subscribers, as we're hoping to hit that soon. And make sure as well that with that you never miss a video by hitting the bell icon. With that said, we have 5 restricted legendaries to cover today, starting off with the weakest being base Necrozma. Now while Dawnwings is a fairly viable restricted legendary, unfortunately base Necrozma is just bad, even with the addition of Terra. Now if you're going to catch base Necrozma, you're really doing this solely to fuse it for one of the Dawnwings or Duskmane forms, but base Necrozma stats are pretty lackluster. Why use a Pokemon with the same typing and a worse stat of a lot of the other Trick Room Psychic types? And not only this, but it's just objectively inferior as a restricted legendary to both Dawnwings and Duskmane. Now even among the non-restricted Pokemon, base Necrozma has a lot of competition for your bulky Psychic type. Now while Prism Armor is an objectively great ability on a defensive Psychic type, and it does allow Necrozma to take reduced damage from incoming super effective attacks, compared to Pokemon like Indeedee and Fergraph, it cannot justify its placement as a Trick Room setter. While Fergraph and Indeedee can both set Trick Room just like Necrozma can, they also have abilities being Armor Tail and Psychic Surge respectively that can block incoming priority and overall support a team really well. These Pokemon also both get Helping Hand, and even in Indeedee's case, it gets the move Follow Me to help support a teammate even more easily. And not only this, but without a secondary typing, it falls flat even compared to options like Gallade, which, while it has a lot lower of a stat spread and a not great defensive ability, is a very powerful offensive Trick Room setter for teams that can absolutely decimate dark types for your team overall that's otherwise going to be very pressured by it. Base Necrozma just can't really hold up, unfortunately, but it's at least a lot better than our previous 3 entries, so I wanted to at least give it some sort of spotlight here. As far as our fusions go, there is one base form that I actually think could be kind of viable and very interesting in VGC, which is our original fusion Pokemon Kyurem. Now Kyurem's actually a pretty interesting option in my opinion, because it is 2 vastly different sets that I think it would probably end up running, and I think especially in a closed team sheet setting, this would be an incredible option for snow teams. For starters, you can use Kyurem as a really stereotypical choice specs option with moves like Draco Meteor, Earth Power, Blizzard, and Freeze Dry, and you could very easily shatter teams, and the few Pokemon you couldn't necessarily just one-shot with this spread, you could just freeze them with Blizzard instead. Especially since on a snow team, Kyurem would have support from Alolan Ninetales to set Aurora Veil, use moves like Icy Wind, and even just give it the snow buff to not only have a physical defense boost, but also to have perfectly accurate Blizzards. Now I truly do think that this Kyurem would be a much better wall breaker than a Pokemon like Iron Bundle for this type of archetype, because Kyurem does hit slightly harder while having a much higher damaging move in Draco Meteor, as opposed to Iron Bundle, which has to use Hydro Pump for this high damaging option that's single target, that has a lower accuracy rate, less damage output, and overall just a weaker Pokemon. I think in tandem with Kyurem's bulk being overall a bit better than Iron Bundles and the ability Pressure being a great ability for such a bulky Pokemon, which would actually be a perfect Alolan Ninetales partner, and I think the synergy would be truly nuts. And especially after an Icy Wind from Alolan Ninetales, this choice specs Kyurem suddenly becomes a very deadly option to break through an opposing team. Now okay, what if Kyurem doesn't want to necessarily have to rely on Alolan Ninetales though? Well thankfully you're in luck, because with the Loaded Dice and Clear Amulet, Dragon Dance Kyurem is actually a very viable option, and it can typically run moves like Dragon Dance, Icicle Spear, Breaking Swipe, and Protect to be a fairly good sweeper. Now while this physical Kyurem could definitely work on a snow team, as it's able to get a nice physical defense boost from the snow being up, and Aurora Veil is just a great way to support a Dragon Dance Kyurem overall, at the same time though, it doesn't need the snow necessarily to stay up to actually hit important moves, since Blizzard is really the only move that's actually affected by the snow. Now you could definitely argue that this particular set would pale in comparison objectively to Baxcalibur, which is a higher attack stat and a much better offensive ability, but that's the thing, you're using this Kyurem as a nice close team sheet option that can kind of bait an opponent. This Kyurem could be a very good option physically or specially, and the counterplay would be so vastly different because of what it would bring to the table, since both offenses have a strong 130 attack stat. So really, you kind of need to choose what Pokemon you're actually going to target here, and Kyurem could be deadly with either set for sure. Now, even as far as Dragonite's Kyurem goes, the speed is a lot better since at +1 you can actually outpace a lot of common Pokemon in that base 90 benchmark, so this really does become an important factor for certain Dragonite's Kyurem variations, and it might even allow you to potentially run in nature like an Adamant nature depending on the meta. I think especially considering the fact that Kyurem could in theory be the better choice than Baxcalibur due to its incredible 95 base speed, so I don't think it's necessarily just an objectively worse option than Baxcalibur, but it definitely would have some fair competition for sure. I think at minimum, especially in a close team sheet format like an in-game ladder, Kyurem would be a legitimately strong option overall, and it would provide a lot to a close team sheet setting. But even in an open team sheet format, Kyurem would definitely find a way to fit itself into several different common archetypes, and I think it would be a cool option that wouldn't necessarily be overpowered. Now this covers all of the Pokemon that at the very least VGC could fairly justify and allow for. However, at the same time, with stat spreads for these Pokemon ranging from base 200 to 660, it's not all that surprising, especially when the one Pokemon that breaks 600 BST is very unoptimized to be a strong option that can just wall break one way or the other. But what about legendary Pokemon that have fairly optimal stats, but just are overall power crept in some capacity? Well, we do have two legendaries still that have never really been viable in VGC at any point, and I really do think that especially despite their incredible typings and stat spreads, these are arguably just very power crept Pokemon that really don't justify being restricted these days. But what legendaries are these, and how good even would they be in doubles? Now our first entry is technically two Pokemon, but it's going to be Giratina's forms, both for the altered form and the origin form. Now Giratina's moveset is truly a shell of what it used to be, with the most important move that it lost, unfortunately, being Tailwind, meaning that Giratina now no longer has the speed control that actually could have maybe made it relevant as a non-restricted pick. Now regardless of what form you use, both Giratinas do have a lot of problems, but let's start off with base Giratina, aka its altered form. This Giratina would typically want to play more defensively, but for a Pokemon that Ghost and Dragon typing, you're really looking for an offensive pick here. Now you could definitely get a lot out of Giratina's offensive moves, since with Ghost and Dragon Stab in the form of moves like Hex or Shadow Ball for a Ghost move and Draco Meteor for a Dragon Stab, next to an option like Aura Sphere to handle Dark types, this would be a very powerful option. However, I think Giratina's status moves are really what's going to allow this form to shine. You have options like Will-O-Wisp to punish any sort of physical attackers, Calm Mind to boost your special defense very well while also gaining some nice offense, and even Pain Split to help Giratina just become completely unkillable. And before the Fairy typing existed, I honestly think this could have been a good set depending on the format. Now unfortunately with the Fairy type being a thing, as well as a lot of top tiers having a really positive matchup into this, having that one offensive move with Giratina is not going to cut it anymore, as options that are focusing around strictly Draco Meteor have to worry about Flutter Mane, and options that are focusing around moves like Shadow Ball or Hex have to worry about any incoming Dark types like Chien-Pao or Kingambit. Flutter Mane and Chien-Pao especially being some of the most threatening Pokemon we've ever received offensively speaking, and they both are very good wall breakers in their own right with two different stabs to combat Giratina. I think it would be pretty hard unfortunately to justify Giratina without making it a Terra Sponge. A defensive typing like Terra Fairy could actually be really good on Giratina, however I'd argue that it's kind of a waste of a Terra pick because typically a lot of these bulkier Terramons don't really do the best in VGC, and unfortunately I think that Giratina Origin would actually be the better Terra Sponge despite being a Pokemon that still has fairly little field presence. Giratina Origin is a slightly more offensive stat line version of Giratina, and with the ability Levitate, it can actually be a pretty good option. This item lock is unfortunately a double-edged sword, because while it does boost Giratina's dual stab of Dragon and Ghost by 1.2 times, while also making sure that Giratina doesn't have to worry about item claws, at the same time though, it does give away your item very easily to the opponent. Now this can cause some headaches because Giratina Origin does benefit a lot from items like Safety Goggles, Citrus Berry, or Leftovers if it could run them in the first place. However, this Giratina, because of the ability Levitate, has actually become a much better Terra user, since its bulk is still fairly respectable, and with the Terra typing of Steel or Fire, this gains a lot of defensive benefits. Now unfortunately, I don't think this is enough to make Giratina necessarily broken per se, even with its origin form, but I think at minimum it would be enough to actually justify using it, and it would have some sort of a use case for sure. I think especially in an open team sheet setting where all the items are revealed anyway, this Giratina would have a lot less of a reason to just be ignored at team preview, and I could legitimately see it doing really well at events. I just don't think it'd be very overpowering by any means. Now, we do still have one really bad legendary to talk about here, and it's arguably the most controversial. Now, this is a pretty notoriously bad Psychic type in VGC that's never really been viable at any point, and in most generations it's considered a bottom tier option for your team, regardless of the allowed Pokemon. No, it isn't Lugia, which at least has had some okay at best results in VGC. No, it's actually Mewtwo. Now, outside of Mega Mewtwo Y having a brief stint in the Oras metagame as a very, very niche pick, Mewtwo really has a lot going for it offensively, but it just doesn't hold out in VGC. Let's first try and define what actually would be ran on Mewtwo if it was allowable, because I think this will hopefully help us actually figure out why this Pokemon might not be good. Mewtwo has a lot that it can go for, and thanks to its 130 base speed, as well as the fact that not a lot of Pokemon right under that speed tier are viable, you could probably justify a modest Mewtwo with Life Orb in most games, since you only need 228 speed to actually creep Pokemon like Ogerpon. This does mean that your Mewtwo could deal some really substantial damage having that offensive boost in nature, and paired with a Pokemon like Indeedee Female, you could do a lot of damage to enemies. From here, I think we can go for any combination of offensive moves like Expanding Force, Side Strike, Flamethrower, Focus Blast, or Ice Beam, as well as partnering this with options like Protect, Recover, or Nasty Plot, depending on how bulky or offensive you want to go here. When you factor in that we're going for a modest nature over timid, this Nasty Plot option especially would be very deadly to a lot of teams. And with the ability Unnerve, your opponent can't even get around this with resistance berries. I feel like especially when we factor in Terra, where you can go for options like Psychic to boost your stab, Stellar, which is going to help a lot with your very wide coverage pool, or even utility Terras like Grass or Ghost, there is a lot that benefits Mewtwo, but at the same time though, I think there's a lot of reasonable counterplay in the format that already is just dominating the game. Now Mewtwo still does have to handle with its rather unimpressive base 130 speed, which while it can justify a modest nature pretty easily, it still is going to always be slower than Pokemon like Chien-Pao and Bluttermane, and these are two of the best ways to offensively just check your Mewtwo outright. As far as Choice Scarf Pokemon go, options like Chiyu or either a Shifu form could definitely also pose a lot of problems for Mewtwo, and while you could intentionally try and make sure that you can invest to live certain hits from these Pokemon, at the same time though, you're gonna have a lot of issues, especially when these Pokemon do run offensive items like Choice Band or Choice Specs and partner themselves on Tailwind teams. And Mewtwo could technically also go even a step further and partner itself on a Tailwind team with Psychic Terrain, but the issue being is that's a very difficult thing to commit a Mewtwo for, and a lot of these Psychic Terrain teams can't justify a Tornadus placement as easily. So it does cause some issues overall for the Mewtwo synergy there. Now even outside of Mewtwo on Psychic Terrain, it still has a lot of other issues, because Pokemon like Rillaboom and Chien-Pao can pose a lot of issues with priority. Since Chien-Pao does have Sucker Punch, which can do a ton of damage to Mewtwo, while Rillaboom has options like Fake Out and U-Turn, so it can constantly put Mewtwo in a bad position, while also then pivoting out and resetting terrain, so it can't just click Expanding Force. You can even go one step further and factor in a Pokemon like Tinglu, which with a standard Assault Vest set that has 100 HP and 252 Spadef, you cannot actually even KO Tinglu from full with a modest nature +2 life or Focus Blast, which is pretty insane that it does require you to go for a Stellar or Fighting Terra to actually KO this, considering the fact that there's a lot of offensive and defensive Pokemon that actually just really work countering Mewtwo. While I think it would be a fairly meta-dominant option, I don't think it would really reshape the format per se, because a lot of the top tier Pokemon bully Mewtwo out of existence outright, with a lot of secondary and tertiary picks still being really good to positively match up into it. Curious to see if you guys think of any Pokemon though that could potentially be unbanned, especially if we were to go with like a Regulation F style rule set. Let me know down below if there's any Pokemon you guys think I might have missed, as I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on them. We might end up doing a part 2 if this video hits 300 likes, and I'd love to see your guys' suggestions for that. Also, while you're on the way down there, consider subscribing, because I do a ton of content just like this, and it's a great way to stay up to date on future videos. And if you want to go one step further, consider supporting with the channel membership, as for just a couple dollars a month, you get early access to videos like this, while also getting to vote on certain topics that we do, such as series where we're going to be buffing certain Pokemon, and that's completely voted on by you guys as channel members. Our current members are Zeke0, Josh K Ultra Player, Blood Lily, Aegis Dex, and stick out your Gyot for the Rizzler. Thank you guys very much for your support, it really does mean the world, and I appreciate seeing you guys on the channel. Finally, check out the links below where I link all of my socials as well as the stuff from my editors, since Dose and Kurt do an incredible job on all the content on this channel, and I really couldn't do it without them. With that said, I'll see you guys in our next upload. Until then, peace out guys.